I think when Jesus says, don't worry about your life, I don't think he's saying, knock it off, quit that. I think what he's saying is, you don't have to. It's not really helping. You have a father who really cares for you.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, it's wonderful to be back with you again this week. And one of my, of course, special things we get to do on this podcast is interview interesting people who have a lot to say. And certainly our guest today is one of those, Alan Fadling. He's been with us before because he wrote the wonderful book, An Unhurried Life. And it was just a rich interview, Alan, when we talked with you about that book. And even as we were talking with you about that book, you were working on this book or had it pretty well in process. And I definitely wanted to have you back and talk some more about this. And so today we're going to be talking with Alan about a non-anxious life, experiencing the peace of God's presence. And so, Alan, thanks for being back with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to get this time together.
And now we were saying offline, we're catching you well rested because you take the month of July off, and you carve out a month or so where you don't take interviews. You kind of back off from internet and emails and so on. Tell us just a little bit how you do that, because I'm sure that just hearing that, there's people saying, "Wow, that would be awesome."
Yeah. Well, the thing I often will say to leaders is resting well is hard work. So what it takes to get a July where I can actually pause and not do the things I normally do in a month, that takes probably 3 or 4 months of pretty focused work, getting ahead on things that I'd normally be doing. So, but what we've discovered is it's well worth it. And, we have a unique kind of work. Not everyone perhaps could do what we're doing, but because so much of what we do requires some creative output, if we don't get a chance to really pause, the tank gets a bit empty and don't feel quite as productive in the ways we want to be. Yeah.
And, I do that in one way in the month of August. I try to not travel and speak very much, if at all. But I'm not as good about disconnecting from electronics and emails. I definitely try to stay off the road and out of airports, at least for business. I'll go see grandkids, but boy, that's even that extra level of backing off from all that email and other things. I think would be awesome. So, but again, I can imagine it takes a lot of discipline for that.
Yes, it is. It is.
Well, you have written a new book on anxiety. And I love the previous book that we talked with you about, just the slowing things down. That hurry is an enemy of God's good for us, oftentimes, and hurry can be a reflection of some things going on in us that we really need God to help us with. But that anxiousness, there's been several articles, some books, different things. It just seemed like anxiety is coming into focus right now. And you cite some statistics early on and said for the decade between 2008 2018, feelings of anxiety among 18 to 25-year-olds doubled. But then in 2020, with, of course, COVID coming, there was a 25% increase in anxiety and depression worldwide. And so I think it's not like anxiety is a new thing, but the increase, the growth of it, the magnitude of it in a relatively short period of time is definitely catching people's attention as a serious issue. I mean, we know COVID, we know some of the things, but why is anxiety coming up to be the great issue, it seems, in many ways in society today?
Yeah, well, I think it may be easy for us to underestimate the lingering impact of a massive change like COVID, depending on where you lived, of course. But there was a rather radical response. Your life changed. Somehow or another, it changed. That I think lingers. And then just add to that economic stressors and political conflict and world conflict and social arguments and cultural changes and then whatever's going on personally. There's just a lot of things. And I think the other thing that, at least for many, a sense of a God who is with us in the midst of it has not always felt strong. We're not, what I say is, unfortunately, my worry has been more like practicing the absence of God than practicing the presence of God. And that kind of practice, unfortunately, develops realities in my attitudes and in my perspectives.
Now, I know that there's been a lot of focus, especially on teenagers, younger people. The depression rates are really at almost a pandemic level among teenagers right now. Do you think that teenagers, younger adults, are they? So I know every generation deals with crises in a different way. If you're a
Yeah.
senior citizen, you might deal differently than a teenager about being quarantined or something. Do you think that there's a reason that young people, because you'd think that young people might be less anxious, that they're young,
Yeah.
energetic. Why would they perhaps be suffering from anxiety in some ways, even perhaps in a greater degree than maybe older adults?
Well, there's probably a lot of factors, and I can't speak as sort of a therapist on this, but I can maybe speak as a pastor. And that is, I notice among the young population a kind of hopelessness that seems new to me. I write in the book about how hope and peace are very good friends. Sadly, anxiety and hopelessness are also often found together. So you talk to a lot of young people, and they think about their futures. And they don't talk about their futures with a great deal of hopefulness. At least some of them don't. And I think that contributes a great deal to a basic sense of angst about the path that lies ahead for them. And I think it looks like, for some, pretty overwhelming anxiety.
Well, certainly social media is a feeder to anxiety, and the younger generation, certainly they make great use of that. And so if you're just feeding off that all the time, I think in many ways, and the 24-hour news cycles as well, but they foster anxiety. I think they're kind of designed almost to do that. And so I think we could probably find some parallels as well. Well, Alan, I always appreciate, and I try to do this when I'm writing as well, a lot of times, is just share my own journey. A lot of times I write on things that has been very personal to me. That's often my best writing, because I'm not writing as a detached professor somewhere just looking at some data, but I'm sharing my own pilgrimage where it matters to me, and the answers I've found or that God has given are life-changing for me personally. And so I love just the candor in which you share about this. You have a number of great quotes. You say, interesting, you say, my anxiety is like buying into a conspiracy theory. I thought that was interesting. You said, I'm learning to upgrade my internal operating system from anxiety to peace. I love that. Anxiety is not an especially wonderful counselor. Again, it's trying to be a counselor, but it's telling us to be worried a lot and that there's not much hope. And then I love the fact you said, I've worried a lot. I sometimes worry about how much I worry. So I appreciate you just being honest with us, that seems to have been an issue for you. And so tell us a little bit about that. It sounds like, has this been a journey that's been throughout a lot of your life up until this time?
Yeah. In fact, I start the book with a story about growing up with, I say that I've been a master of anxiety. And by that, I mean, I've quite practiced in the art of worry. Like anything, you can practice worrying and you can get really good at it. You might not want to be, but you do. But I talk about my mom growing up in a post-World War II Midwestern orphanage, so from 4 to 14, she and her big sister and her big brother, they lived with a lot of want. And you learn anxiety in a setting like that. And that little girl, that young lady, becomes a wife and then becomes a mom and has a firstborn son, me. And, I'm not blaming my 83-year-old mother for my
Yeah.
struggle with anxiety, but ours was a family that was in many ways run by anxiety. So even as I wrote the book, I dedicated the book to my mom, and I talked with her about what I was going to share, and she knew, and she agreed, yep, that was our journey. But I just sort of learned to manage my life on the basis of anxiety. It drove me. I imagined that it was fuel, like it got me moving. It pushed me to high standards. I thought it was almost an asset, you know? Part of my
Yeah.
growth was realizing, if anxiety is fuel, it's fuel that burns dirty and increasingly does harm to my health, to the quality of my relationships, to the quality of my work. It's not great fuel. Peace
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder a lot about just parenting. My kids are all young adults now, but especially during COVID, I just felt like, now they're adults, they have their own families, their own kids, but still they look to me as kind of the patriarch of my immediate family, and if they see me worrying and fretting all the time, I'm sure that that's going to put those thoughts, well, maybe we should be worried too. If dad is anxious, dad is troubled and anxiously sitting in front of the TV hour after hour, watching for the latest update, maybe we should be doing that. And so I could certainly see that in your own upbringing. If on the other hand, I felt like at times, even when I'm around my grandkids, how do I teach them to not stick their head in the sand, but not immediately hit the panic, anxious button every time there's a problem too, to stay calm, to have hope. I think for me, a lot of times I realize even if I'm not necessarily struggling with anxiety, I need to be modeling coping mechanisms to those around me that maybe are still trying to figure out how they're going to handle it. And I appreciate that. You made a great comment. You always make lots of great comments. You obviously you must either you're just well, I'm sure you are just a very profound person, or I've also found when I'm writing, some phrases you need to work on until you get them just right. And so you've got lots of those phrases that are very
Oh,
quotable, tweetable. And you said Jesus wants us to experience his Father's table, not just serve at it. And I thought that was a great quote. And so unpack that for us.
yeah. Thank you. I love that idea, because that grows out of something Jesus says in the upper room to his inner circle when he says, I no longer call you servants. A servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything I've learned from my Father, I have made known to you. And when I read that, I had this mental image of a supper table, and the Father is sitting at the head. And some are seated at the table enjoying the meal, and some are serving the meal. And I realized sometimes in my own life, I felt more like the person bringing the meal to the table and leaving than I felt like someone sitting at the table enjoying the friendship of my Father. So I love that image of, as a pastor, I used to imagine as a young pastor that God was my boss. And to be honest, God as boss was not an inviting image that I wanted to have lots of communion with. I was afraid I'd get more work if I got too close. And that's nothing about God. That's about me. So the image of, no, I'm invited to the table with Father and Son, and they want to let me in on what they're intending and what they're wanting to do. What an honor that is.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, it has connotations of Mary and Martha, doesn't it? Martha was the one serving all the time.
Yes.
And Mary was like, she found her place and sat down, was ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's awesome. And I know a lot of wonderful people serving the Lord faithfully, but yeah, I love that. Sometimes go ahead and take off your serving clothes and have a seat and enjoy the fellowship. You have an interesting statement. You said we can learn to translate our anxiety into prayers. And I love that. Sometimes I mean, the anxiety's there, the thoughts are there, the concerns are there. You can't necessarily just deny them, but tell us how you translate your worries into prayers.
Yeah. So part of what I'm thinking there is I have sometimes prayed, Lord, take away my worry. Understandable prayer. I don't want to worry anymore.
Hmm.
But the reality is, I think my worry is just a good thing misdirected. I
Huh.
care. I care. I care about people. I care about things. But if my caring gets detached from God's bigger caring, it tends to turn into worry.
Yeah. Yeah. In
And
fact, I
so,
like the phrase you said where you said, if you're not anxious, maybe you don't care.
yeah, well, exactly. You don't worry about
Yeah.
stuff you don't care about.
Huh.
So anyway, what I've realized is when I'm finding myself worrying about something or someone, the way I can translate that into prayer is just saying, "Oh Lord, I care so much about this person, about one of my sons, let's say, one of my 3 adult sons, or some initiative that we're involved in as a nonprofit. And boy, I'm concerned that it go well, that it do well, that it be well received." Well, now I have a basis for a conversation with the Father.
Yeah.
You care even more about this than I do.
Hmm.
How would you be guiding me? What do you want to say? What are you doing? How can I
Hmm.
join you? And suddenly now, this caring that I feel so deeply is something I'm experiencing in communion with God rather than separate from God. And that's
Hmm.
part of what I think translating anxiety into praying looks like, how it looks to me.
Wow. And just as Peter said, just casting all of your cares upon him, just as you take that anxiety and just cast it right on over to him in prayer. And what
Yes.
a beautiful picture that is. Of course, you have lots of memorable phrases. You also, I love that you have a phrase saying, "We live by inhaling grace." And I love
Hmm.
that. I think in your book on hurry, you said maybe Jesus moved at the pace of grace, and I love that phrase too. But you also you go on to say, worrying in the presence of such a gracious God is like going hungry while seated at a lavish table full of fine food.
Mm.
And again, I've seen that contrast often. We say we trust God, but then we're worrying, or we say that God is all powerful, but then we're worried. We say we know God loves us with an infinite love, but we're worried. And so I love that picture of just we're at a banquet table and we're going hungry. And then somehow, why is there a disconnect? Because if you're a Christian, you probably go to church every week hearing about how wonderful and loving God is. And we've barely gotten home and we're worried and fretting and fearful after just being reminded that we have a loving Heavenly Father.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of what you said a minute ago about, for example, for young adults, how much social media shapes our thinking and forms us. It
Hmm.
presses us to think about worrisome stuff. Oh, this is going wrong. And those people are arguing. And this is bad, and that is bad, and this is bad. Well, if you practice that kind of thinking, it's going to have an effect on your perspective. Of course it is. That's how we
Hmm.
work. And so
Hmm.
it's been helpful for me to think, what I could learn to do is practice the presence of a generous God who treats
Hmm.
me, who delights in mercy, who longs, absolutely longs to be gracious, to use a line
Hmm.
from Isaiah. Like, this isn't
Hmm.
just something God's willing to do, this is something God's longing to do. This is what
Hmm.
he wishes in the relationship he's enjoying with each of us. And so for me, a line like Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, or make it active, the Lord is shepherding me. I am
Hmm.
not going to find myself in a situation of want. Maybe it's going to
Hmm.
be love and mercy that follows me all the days of my life instead of doom and gloom and danger and threat.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm in the presence of someone that good and that generous. And I think as you practice that, that becomes more and more of a perspective that you just deeply trust.
Yeah. And going along with that, you said practice helps us learn how truth works. And I like that because we may know it in our head, but
Yeah.
sometimes we got to practice what we know in our head.
Well, yeah. I mean, try it on. See how it works. I mean, Jesus in the Gospel of John says, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I'm just saying this stuff on my own. It's like when
Hmm.
you try it on, when you choose to do the things God's inviting you to do, and you realize this works. I'm a little more joyful and peaceful than I was before. Maybe I should keep doing this.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure at first it gets hard because we want to keep grabbing the steering wheel. We're worried. What if it doesn't? What if God doesn't steer my life correctly? What if it's a disaster? But I think
Oh,
that the more you practice letting Him guide you, to shepherd you, the more I
yeah.
think, hopefully, you get more and more comfortable just releasing that to Him, and He's never let you down yet, and so you begin to sense, I doubt He's going to let me down this time too. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
that's
true.
now you had of course, I keep repeating myself saying you just have lots of great phrases, but you do, and I love the phrase, "I don't have to let the fog of my mood determine the perspective of my soul." Now unpack that
Yeah.
one for me. Very well said, and there's a lot there, very practical. But how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, so, where I live here in Orange County, California, we're close enough to the ocean that sometimes we'll wake in the morning to a marine layer. And when there's a marine layer, a fog, there's no sun. You don't see any sun. You just see fog. Well, our moods are like that fog. And if you were narrow visioned enough, you might imagine the sun will never come back. Like fog
Uh,
is permanent. Now, I suppose if you lived in some other part of the United States, fog is more permanent than it is right here. But here, it tends to burn off by mid late morning, depends on the day. It helps me to think of my mood as a fog. The reality of God is still just as real, even though I feel a bit depressed or a bit anxious or very. I mean, if you want to use another metaphor, there's a mountain and there's a cloud. The cloud is the mood, the mountain is God. The clouds come and go. The mountain is not moving. The mountain is rooted. It was there before I showed up. It'll be there when I'm long gone. God's more like the mountain than like the fog. And so all of that perspective helps me just put my mood in a bit of perspective, not let it become the universe, but let it become a part of my reality today. But God's part of it too.
Yeah, and I think we live in an age where we've magnified our feelings so much that if we feel that way, it must be so. But yeah, but no matter how foggy it is, that it doesn't mean that mountain is in any way different than it's always been.
That's right.
And to sometimes just, I think you have to. I think sometimes you just have to kind of believe and trust and overrule your feelings. At the moment, my feelings say all is hopeless, but in your mind, you know what God has said, what He's promised, and what He's always done in the past. And sometimes you just hold on to that until the fog finally lifts. And so, yeah, the great phrase. You had a statement: "Peace is grounded in a vision of a solid God in a shaky world." And I think that's kind of
Hmm.
touching on the same thing. That's
Yeah.
what peace. You base your peace not on the circumstances of the moment or your feelings of the moment, but on God. That's the mountain. That's He's solid, and you got to base your peace on something that's not as fleeting as fog or a feeling.
Yeah.
You had an interesting statement. You said that anxiety can be God-given energy misplaced. I think you
Hmm.
touched on that earlier, but God-given, because we don't think that God would necessarily be the author of something awful like anxiety, but there is energy that comes from anxiety. And yeah,
Yeah.
and so you say a God-given energy misplaced. What does that mean?
Well, if you think maybe really big picture, Augustine had this idea that sin is really a good thing distorted or
Hmm.
misdirected. An idol is often a good thing that's we're trying to turn into a god. It
Hmm.
doesn't work so well, doesn't end up turning out great. Well, if
Hmm.
you sort of have that idea in mind, then like I said, if anxiety is my caring, the energy of my caring misdirected, well, then I'm not asking God to take it away. I'm asking Him to help me properly direct it.
Hmm.
What did you mean for this to be, God? I've turned it
Hmm.
into anxiety, but I think you had a different idea in mind than I've had. And
Hmm.
of course, the great commandment hadn't changed for centuries: love God with all heart, mind, soul, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. My anxiety is sort of just a distorted version of trying to live out a loving life in relation to God and to my neighbor. So to me, it helps to think more about redirecting than just eliminating and then, I don't know, somehow recreating something new so I can be a lover of God and a lover of people. Now, maybe it'll just be the
Yeah.
redirecting what's already there in the right way.
I like that because I think sometimes we can feel guilty about being anxious, and we're so busy trying to root it all out and not be anxious anymore, that it would be much easier sometimes, like you said, redirect that into prayers, into asking God to give you His perspective, just drawing closer to Him. Yeah, so I think some helpful advice. And you said something else I also really liked. It said you said that repentance is not just about a major failing, but you suggested it is a word of gentle turnings again and again, to face God, to walk in light of God, to come out of my habits of hiding and escaping. Because we tend to think, well, repentance is how you get saved. You repent of your sin, and it's a life-changing moment that you basically do once to be converted. But I love that phrase. It's a word of gentle turnings again and again. And unpack that for us. What does that look
Yeah.
like? How often should we
Yeah.
be having those gentle turnings?
Well, I would just say probably anytime you realize you've been distracted or you've been looking elsewhere, that's probably a good moment for a gentle turning. For me, I didn't grow up in a religious home. Church was not a major part of my childhood or youth. It wasn't until my senior year in high school that I experienced what some would call a moment of repentance, a significant turning of my life toward God in Christ. And that was a major turning point for me. But as I look then over the next, the last 40 some years, there have been many moments of turning. Moments when, for example, as a pastor, I realized I had been pursuing the work of God to avoid something God was trying to do in my life. And I needed to turn. I needed to turn from the ways I had actually turned some ministry successes into a kind of idol. I needed to turn from that. Or I needed to turn from habits of trying to do my thing for God and then ask God to bless it. I was misguided. I was needing to turn, God, what are you doing? And this has been your message for the longest time. What are you doing, God? And how can I join you in what you're doing? It seems to me that involves turnings all the time, little turnings of, oh, yes, I've been trying to do my own thing, hoping you'd like it and bless it. And I think I've been misguided in that.
I work a lot with leaders, and at times I'll tell them, so sometimes you need a major overhaul, and there are just some major things that need changing. But a lot of times it's really more, I'd say it's a matter of tweaking. The tweak here, tweak there, and tweaks
There
add
you
up
go.
over time. It's
They
not like
sure
you're a
do.
horrible, terrible person, but you've got this bad habit that's crept in, and this just. It's not an unforgivable sin. It's just this one little habit that you do and you don't even realize you're doing it. But address those just here and there, and and I just think that God is a loving God that doesn't want to hit you over the head with a hammer every time you need to change. It's if you can have a gentle turning, that's I think that's His preference to use that approach. If we'll just go
Yeah.
along with that. You said that you talk about some practices that help with anxiety and dealing with those, and there's an interesting one. Well, they're all interesting, but you mentioned sameness, and I thought that was interesting. How sameness can help deal with anxiety. What do you mean by that? Because we think if
So,
we're anxious, we probably need to change what we're doing, not
yeah.
move toward sameness.
Well, if you thought of it in terms of like the language of a healthy heart, you want a healthy rhythm. You don't want arrhythmia. That's not good when it comes to hearts. And there's a kind of sameness. Like you want a heartbeat that is steady. Like if you felt your pulse and it was going racing and then it was slowing and then it was racing, a cardiologist wouldn't be thrilled with that kind of a heart rhythm. So
Yeah.
that's part of it. I think there's a way of being able to live in a kind of holy rhythm. I think sometimes we're afraid of rhythms. We think they'll be boring. We think they'll be mundane. We think they'll be empty. But that particular practice came in a chapter where I was talking about my own personal practice of retreat. And with that comes practices like solitude or silence or stillness. Sameness was a way of saying, I'm tempted to think that my life with God requires constant variety, like a new thing, a new thing, a new thing, a new thing. Now, God does new things, yes, but my life with God is not just one constant innovation, variety, new thing. I can get very attached to excitement. Well, excitement only goes so deep. Sameness and joy, they go together quite well. Joy has a rootedness to it that sameness allows to go deeper. So those were some of the ideas I was trying to get at when I talked about that practice.
I did enjoy just your talking, especially in the mornings, how some of the routines you have in the morning and watching the birds in the morning. I have a bird feeder and a bird bath right outside my office window. And I tell you, till later in life, I didn't have time to notice birds. I lived in Canada for a while, and they were all shivering, and they weren't very colorful. Most of them, it wasn't a pretty sight. But now that I live in the South, boy, those beautiful colored birds, I feed them and watch them, but again, that starting your morning out, I loved how you just described watching the day coming and the birds and so on. That could be a wonderful sort of ritual each day to start that out, just in a lot of ways. It was very picturesque.
So in this case, that grew as a practice for me as I was reading the Sermon on the Mount, and I heard Jesus say, consider the birds. You don't see them out there, slaving away, planting a field, or, eventually harvesting it or storing up the extra for a rainy day. You don't see them doing any of that. And they don't seem to be very anxious. So for me, I mean, literally watching the birds is kind of like, maybe they could coach me on this way of living less anxiously than I've been in the habit of doing. And that actually has been the case. I mean, the crows sometimes sound angry, but most of those birds, just on a day-to-day basis, they seem to know they are living in the care of a Heavenly Father. That's something I'm growing in just by watching them.
That's wonderful. Now, you mentioned in your earlier book, you talked a bit about Sabbath, but you come back and say about Sabbath rest. Simply, at a certain point, you ask a question. Simply put, who will do better work, the one who is tired, burdened, and overwhelmed, or the one who is at peace, refreshed, and energized? And you make an interesting observation that you say that the whole idea of rest that Jesus said might very well be one of the best facets of Jesus' good news of the kingdom. And you think, especially in our day of frenetic, anxious, hurried living, a Savior who says, "Come unto me, and I will give you rest." That sounds like a pretty powerful, attractive message to our current culture right now.
I think so. It struck me as I was working on this book, that Jesus is the Prince of Peace. That's an interesting description of him. Now, sometimes we limit that to sort of a Christmassy message, and we're celebrating that Isaiah passage. Great. But what would it mean that every single day Jesus is with me as an absolute Prince of Peace? Yeah. And what is that why kids love to be near him? He was such a non-anxious presence. He was just non-threatening, and they loved being with him. Was that why sinners loved to have him come to their party and be with them? Was there something about him that was just so inviting? I just think I would like to be the kind of person whose life recommends the good news of the gospel, especially when it comes to living a more peaceful sort of life. I think that's an amazing facet of the gospel. Yeah.
Yeah. And what a great opportunity for Christians to be demonstrating that peace.
I
And to
think so.
show that when you follow the Prince of Peace, everybody else is worried and anxious, but the Jesus followers, still they're following the Prince of Peace, and so of course they've got peace that is can't get anywhere else unless you get it from Him. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, great. You just you alluded to this statement a moment ago, but you had another candid comment where you said, "I have pursued work for God to escape the face of God." And
Mm.
again, another you stop to think about kind of statement. But what do you mean? I pursued work for God to escape the face of God.
Well, one of the things I'll often say to people, whether they are in vocational paid sort of ministry roles or whether they're just faithful volunteers, one of the things I want to say to people is you understand that God didn't choose you mostly because He needed another worker. Now,
Yeah.
working with God is one of the great honors that we have, but we work with Him
Hmm.
as sons or daughters. We are in a family business, you know. We're
Hmm.
joining God who
Hmm.
loves us. We're not working to earn something. We're not working to avoid something. We're working to express something. And so it helps me to
Hmm.
remember God is working in me. That's important to Him. He wants my attention there. He wants me to interact with Him. Anything He says to me that might even be a little bit of a corrective nature, that's good news for me. May not feel like it in the moment,
Yeah.
but Hebrews says,
Hmm.
fathers who love their kids, they train them and are
Yeah.
attentive. Well, that's what I mean. That I imagined I could keep doing great things for God and just avoid the thing God was trying to talk with me about. And that wasn't what He wanted. And in
Hmm.
the end, it wasn't actually what I wanted either.
Hmm. Well, you make an observation about where Jesus said in Matthew 11, "Come unto me, all you are weary, and I'll give rest." But He says, "Take my yoke upon you," which, of course, a yoke is an instrument of labor, of work.
Yeah.
And you just say that for some it might be a bit, they might be a bit puzzled that Jesus' strategy for rest was an implement of work. And so unpack that for us. Yeah, it's because it's like, well, Jesus tells me to come and get rest, but then He's hitching me up to a yoke and a plow. That
Yeah.
doesn't seem very restful. I think I'll stay in my hammock. But what is it
Right.
about working alongside Jesus that is actually can bring rest?
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine here? Take my wheelbarrow, something we would now use for work. It's like, but I'm
Yeah.
tired. I thought yeah. So what I like to say is the reason the yoke of my work, let's say, yoke, it was a word that would have been used to describe the relationship of a student and a rabbi. And of
Hmm.
course, it was an implement that would be used by any farmer to, plow a line or to carry a load. The reason I think Jesus invites us to His yoke is that He wants us to be
Hmm.
students of His, I would say, unhurried way, His peaceful way. That what makes my work hard often is the anxiety I add to it. That makes my
Hmm.
work harder, even if it was already hard. The two things I
Hmm.
think about the yoke of Jesus that helps us rest is one, we're never working alone.
Yeah.
And in that day, usually a yoke would involve two animals. Frequently, there'd be an experienced animal and a young learner. And the experienced
Hmm.
animal knew what they were doing, and that little one would learn alongside. I think Jesus is
Hmm.
in the yoke with us. I imagined as a young leader that when Jesus said, "Take my yoke," He was carrying this big beam of wood. He tossed it in the air over to me, and it lunked in my arms. Now I'm carrying it. I think the image is more
Yeah.
like Jesus saying, "I'm in the yoke. Join me here. Let's carry this together. Let's do this work together." That makes it restful because I'm not alone and I'm not even carrying the heavy end when it comes down to it.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think anyone who's ever worked in a setting where you were working with someone else or several others that they were having, it might have been hard, laborious work, but they were having fun. They were joking. They were
Yes.
telling funny stories while they worked and poking fun at each other, and before you knew it, coffee break had come, and you couldn't believe how the time flew because it was fun who you're working with. And I think,
Absolutely.
in a sense, yeah, you're going step by step with Jesus right next to you. Any task would be delightful and refreshing when you're that close to Him. And I've always loved that idea of a yoke, because we tend to wander, we tend to drift from the presence of God. But a yoke kind of keeps us in place, and almost as if Jesus would say, if you just stay close to me for a prolonged period of time, there's a lot of stuff will rub off, and you'll love it. But
Yes,
so here, this will help you with that. uh,
absolutely.
and you had one other thing. Just I know we're run out of time, but one other, I thought, very practical way you described just praying over your work the day before. I really
Yeah.
like that. Very practical. We all have had days coming up that we're feeling overwhelmed. We know we're going to be on the run, lots to do, lots of responsibility. And just walk us through just a little. You give a wonderful way of, instead of dreading what's coming, you talk about praying over the work that is ahead of you. How do you do that?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of us, I imagine, plan our day the night before. Or the week, the night before the week on Sunday, let's say. And I've had that habit for a while. But more recently, what I've learned is when I notice something in my schedule, maybe it's an appointment I'm a little nervous about, or I feel a little overwhelmed by, or for me, writing is a continuously challenging process. I heard one author recently said, I'm not sure I like writing. I like having written.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do too. I really
Yeah.
identified with that. Sometimes it's like,
Yeah.
or I think Ray Bradbury said, yeah, oh no, writing's not hard at all. I just open up a vein and bleed. It's as easy as that. So anyway, so what I do, especially if I see something in my plans, whether it's an appointment on my calendar or a project I'm working on, I like to pray specifically. What would I like God to do? How might God be generous in that moment? What difference would it make if I imagined I'm doing that task or conducting that meeting in the presence of God, in the companionship of God? I remember one time this ended up in my book, An Unhurried Leader. I was with a group of Russian pastors in St. Petersburg. This would have been 7 or 8 years ago. And I was trying to talk about this idea of working with God, and they were nodding their heads at the American who was sharing all these things, but I didn't feel like they were getting it. And I felt bad about that. So I had this little brainstorm. Maybe it was a gift from God. And I just said, do this. Write down a list of the stuff you do in a day or in a week. Just some of the tasks, some of the meetings, some of the regular stuff. Write the list. They did. I said, how do you feel about it? Some of them, oh, I'm so grateful I get to do this. Some of them, oh man, I'm overwhelmed by this list I just wrote. I said, okay, now do this. At the end of each of those lines, write 2 words, with God. And I watched their faces. They started smiling. Even the ones who said they felt privileged by the things they get to do as pastors in their case. The idea that they're doing it with God just sort of shone a light. It sort of brought hopefulness. It wasn't a thing they were doing for God, like God was, 1,000 miles away at a home office or something, and I'm out here at the satellite office. There was a sense of with God. So when I pray for my to-do list, my tasks for the next day, it helps me to sort of imagine and envision that God's with me in each of those things that I'm doing. It's energizing. It inspires creativity. I feel more hopeful. I don't feel alone doing some of what I'm doing.
And I'm imagining when you then climb into bed, your night's sleep is going to be different. Because you've
Yeah,
given all that, and imagine how God's going to take care of you the next day. How it's not going to be a disaster that you fear, and I imagine you sleep better after that as well.
that's true.
Well, what anything else that you just share? I think anxiety is the kind of thing. I think a lot of times, if you just in a room of Christians, you say, "How many of you are feeling anxious?" There'll be those who'll be honest about it, but they'll also be embarrassed because Christians
Yeah,
aren't
I
supposed to
shouldn't.
feel that way.
Right.
Yeah, it's but I think that I think that's something that at some point I would imagine everybody feels at some point. Some more
Yeah.
than others, but the right circumstance, or when we're tired and worn down
Yes.
and whatever, anxiety. I find if I'm going to feel anxious, a lot of times it's when I haven't had time to be prepared. If I feel like,
Mm.
okay, I've been just running. Sometimes I'm speaking in 3. I've even spoken in 4 states in 1 week, and wherever I'm ending up at the end of that chain is probably the least prepared, because I've been looking over my notes for the
Yeah.
beginning of the week, and by the end of the week, it's, oh no, what am I talking on, and how long do I
Oh
have,
man.
and that anxiety starts to mount for me, because I know that I've had limited time, and I've run out. But we all have things that will cause that in one way or another. Any last advice or counsel, or just even something just
Yeah.
to go away thinking about that would be helpful?
So I've been asked, as I'm talking about this book, a question, some version of this question. So is anxiety a sin?
Hmm.
And what I want to say is, I just don't know that that's a very helpful question. I think the people who are worrying already feel pretty bad about what they're doing. I don't think you need to
Yeah.
make sure to highlight that and shine a big bright light on it. I think when Jesus
Hmm.
says, "Don't worry about your life," I don't think he's saying, "Knock it off, quit that." I think what
Hmm.
he's saying is, you don't have to. It's not really helping. You have a father who really cares for you and
Hmm.
wants to take care of you. And so, what I want to say to people is, look, your anxiety is a reality. You can feel it in your body, you can feel it in your emotions and in your thinking. God is real,
Hmm.
maybe even more real than your anxiety. And you could learn to practice the presence of a wonderful counselor, a truly wonderful counselor, a good shepherd, a prince of peace who is always with you, even when the fog of your moods sort of obscures that reality. I just think
Hmm.
I've been so grateful to learn how to find peace right in the middle of my worrisome emotions. That's the peace that Jesus gives that's greater than what the world gives.
Wow. Wow. Great word. Well, Alan, as always, rich. We've just gone to the well and got lots of clean, fresh, cold water to refresh our
Oh,
souls. Certainly encourage folks to get both books we mentioned today, The Unhurried Life. Get that one if you haven't read it. He's got a bunch of other books as well, and so we'll leave links in the show notes how to go straight to get that book and others. I've just found Alan to be one of those wise of authors that you just can't really go wrong. Just letting him
mm,
help you think about some wonderful truths that I think just fill your mind with those kind of thoughts, and you'll find anxiety having a hard place to get a foothold. Because you've got so many noble thoughts of God and His mountain-like stability in your life, and so, Alan, thank you for giving us this time. I know that you kind of have to jump back into the life and the work again too, but we really appreciate you taking time to come and just share with all of our listeners today.
it was just a great treat to have the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.